The silence in Vance and Son Antiquarian Books was a living thing, thick, with the scent of decaying paper, cracked leather, and a century of settled dust. It was Alara's constant companion, a shroud she had wrapped herself in for so long she no longer remembered the sound of her own laughter. Sunlight, heavy and golden, cut through the grimy front window, illuminating millions of dancing dust motes in the air, tiny forgotten stories swirling in the stillness. Each particle seemed to represent a moment of life she had never lived, a world she only observed from behind the safety of the glass. This sanctuary, built by her grandfather and now her responsibility, had become a beautiful, hallowed prison, and its silence was the sound of her youth quietly turning to dust alongside the forgotten tomes. If you want to know what shatters this sacred silence, watch until the end. I invite you to subscribe to the channel and comment where you are watching from. We continue. At 22, Alara Vance moved with the quiet, careful grace of someone much older, as if afraid a sudden movement might cause the fragile world around her to crumble. Her reflection in the dark wood of the checkout counter was a pale, serious face framed by mousy brown hair, her large, hazel eyes holding a depth of sorrow that didn't belong to someone so young. Her hands, though, were her most expressive feature, slender and deft. They could mend a broken spine or trace the gilded letters on a first edition with a lover's tenderness. This shop was her inheritance, a legacy of debt and duty passed down from an ailing father who now resided in the small apartment upstairs. She was not its owner, but its custodian, the guardian of a dying dream that consumed every waking moment and whispered to her in her sleep. She lived more through the pages of the book she curated than in her own skin. She had traveled to windswept moors with Catherine, navigated the treacherous ballrooms of Regency England with Elizabeth Bennet, and felt the sting of unrequited love with countless heroines. Yet, when she closed the final page, the return to her own reality was a jarring descent into a colorless existence. The grand passions, the daring choices, the life-altering kisses, they were all borrowed emotions, fleeting echoes in the profound emptiness of her own story. She was a spectator to life, a ghost haunting the aisles of her own bookstore, her heart a library of second-hand feelings. The greatest tragedy, she often thought, was not that she was alone, but that she had forgotten how to even wish for anything more than the quiet turning of a page. Her virginity was not a conscious choice, not a moral stance or a treasured gift she was saving. It was simply a fact, a quiet consequence of her self-imposed exile. It was the physical manifestation of the walls she had built around her heart, brick by painstaking brick of filial obligation and a deep, gnawing fear of the world outside. Men were characters in novels, their touch a thing of ink and imagination. The idea of real, tangible intimacy was as foreign and terrifying as the bustling, indifferent city that roared just beyond her door. It was an unopened chapter in her own life, a book she lacked the courage to even pull from the shelf, its cover uncreased, its pages still bound together by the publisher's seal. It was a testament to a life lived in the margins, pristine and untouched, but also unread and unknown. The weight of her reality pressed down on her from all sides, as tangible as the leaning towers of books that threatened to collapse. Tucked inside a worn copy of Moby Dick was a stack of crimson-stamped envelopes, medical bills for her father that grew more insurmountable with each passing week. The scent of antiseptic and sickness faintly drifted from the upstairs apartment, a constant reminder of the slow, painful decay of the man who had once been her anchor. The building itself seemed to groan under the strain, the paint on the facade peeling like sunburnt skin, the foundation settling deeper into the forgotten corner of Boston it occupied. Every creak of the floorboards, every flicker of the old fluorescent lights, was a whisper of failure, a countdown to the moment when duty would no longer be enough to hold back the flood of ruin. Sometimes, standing by the front window, she would watch the world pass by, a vibrant, chaotic tapestry she could never be a part of. She'd see couples walking hand in hand, their laughter carrying on the breeze, their casual intimacy a secret language she would never understand. They moved with an unconscious freedom, an entitlement to happiness that felt like a deliberate cruelty. She would instinctively shrink back from the glass, her reflection a ghostly superimposition over the lively street. The world outside felt rapacious and sharp-edged, a place that would chew up and spit out someone as soft and fragile as her. The bookshop was her shield, its dusty silence, a defense against a life that demanded too much, a world that promised a pain she was certain she could not survive. She was safe in her fortress of paper, but safety was just another word for captivity. As twilight bled across the sky, casting long, melancholic shadows across the aisles, Elara began her nightly ritual of closing. The turn of the old brass key in the heavy oak door was a definitive, resonant click that echoed the closing of her own heart. She would switch off the lights one by one, plunging the stories into darkness until only the faint moonlight illuminated the spines, their titles like epitaphs on 1,000 tiny tombs. Standing there in the gloom, surrounded by the ghosts of other people's lives, a profound sense of resignation would wash over her. This was her world, her fate, sealed and delivered. She had accepted it. But deep in the quietest, most repressed corner of her soul, a dangerous question sometimes flickered to life, a tiny, desperate spark in the overwhelming dark. Is this all there is? Her days were measured not in hours, but in rituals of care. Each morning began in the dim, cramped apartment above the shop, a space saturated with the cloying, sweet smell of her father's illness and the sharp tang of rubbing alcohol. She would prepare his breakfast, a simple tray of toast and tea, her movements silent and practiced so as not to disturb his fragile sleep. The clink of the spoon against the ceramic mug was the loudest sound in their shared world. She would help him sit up, his body frail and bird-like beneath the thin blankets, his gratitude a whispered, wheezing thing that felt more like an apology. This quiet servitude was her life's metronome, a steady, unyielding rhythm of duty that drowned out the frantic, irregular beat of her own youthful heart, a heart that had forgotten what it was to want anything for itself. Her father, Arthur Vance, had once been a man of words and booming laughter, a giant who could recite Keats and balance a stack of encyclopedias on one hand. Now he was a ghost haunting the edges of his own life, his mind a flickering candle in the wind of his failing body. He communicated through feeble gestures and eyes that held a universe of unspoken regret. He never spoke of the debt, of the shop's decline, or of the future he had stolen from her. Yet his silence was a form of tyranny, a gentle but absolute demand for her sacrifice. His pride, a stubborn remnant of the man he used to be, prevented them from accepting charity or selling the shop sooner, trapping Elara in a noble, slow-motion shipwreck from which he refused to let her swim away. His love was a cage lined with velvet. The neighborhood itself was an accomplice in her confinement. This forgotten corner of Boston was a relic, a cluster of brick-and-mortar buildings with proud historic facades that hid decaying interiors. It was a place bypassed by progress, where the same families had run the same small businesses for generations. The butcher knew her order by heart, the old woman at the bakery always gave her a pitying smile, and the pharmacist would discreetly slide her a sample of a new pain medication for her father. Their kindness was a form of social surveillance, their collective gaze, a constant reminder of her role as the dutiful Vance daughter. She was a local fixture, a tragic heroine in a small-town play, and every sympathetic nod felt like another nail being hammered into the coffin of her own unlived life. The financial pressure was a physical presence, a monster that lived in their mailbox. Each afternoon, she would retrieve the mail with a knot of dread in her stomach, sorting through the junk mail to find the inevitable, crisply folded letters with transparent windows revealing the logos of hospitals and collection agencies. Spreading them on the shop counter under the weak light, the numbers would blur into an incomprehensible tide of red ink. It wasn't just the amount that terrified her, it was the cold, impersonal language, the threats of legal action, the deadlines that loomed like execution dates. She felt a profound, burning shame, as if their poverty were a moral failing, a secret sickness that she had to hide from the world, even as it was slowly, methodically consuming everything she had left. Her mother's memory was another ghost in the house, a portrait of stern, traditional womanhood that hung in the hallway and in Elara's mind. She had been a woman who believed in duty, sacrifice, and the importance of a good match. Elara could still hear her voice, a constant, critical whisper, reminding her that a woman's value lay in her virtue and her ability to secure a stable future through a respectable man. "No man wants a girl with burdens," her mother used to say, her eyes scanning Elara as if assessing her market value. This inherited dogma had become a part of Elara's internal architecture, a belief that her current circumstances made her unworthy of love or desire. She was damaged goods, her father's illness, and the shop's debt, the visible stains on her character. The world outside the shop's front doors seemed to move at a different, more vibrant frequency. From her perch behind the counter, she watched university students from the nearby campus, their backpacks overflowing with books and their faces bright with an easy, unburdened confidence. They would sometimes wander in, laughing and talking about parties, exams, and futures filled with limitless possibilities. They spoke a language of hope she couldn't comprehend. An interaction with a girl her age buying a book on feminist theory left Ilara feeling hollow and anachronistic, a character from a forgotten Victorian novel trapped in the 21st century. They were living the chapters she would only ever get to read about, their lives unfolding in brilliant color while hers was written in monochrome shades of gray. The oppression was etched onto her very body. She was perpetually tired, a deep, bone-weary exhaustion that no amount of sleep could cure. There were faint lavender smudges beneath her eyes, and her shoulders were permanently hunched forward, as if bracing against an invisible weight. She ate standing up, usually a cold sandwich or leftovers from her father's meal, her own needs an afterthought. Her clothes were neat but worn, her sweaters frayed at the cuffs, her single pair of sturdy shoes scuffed at the toes. She had stopped seeing her own reflection, not out of vanity, but because the girl staring back was a stranger, a pale, weary custodian whose only purpose was to tend to the needs of others and the ghosts of the past. The legacy of Vance & Son was the heaviest burden of all. The gold leaf letters on the front window, faded and peeling, were a constant indictment. The son in the name referred to her father, who had inherited the shop from his own father. There was no "and daughter." She was an addendum, a temporary placeholder tasked with preserving a patriarchal history she could never truly be a part of. Every dusty, unsold book felt like a personal failure. Every creak of the floorboards sounded like her grandfather's disappointed sigh. She was drowning in a sea of history, trying to keep a dead man's dream afloat while her own life sank silently beneath the surface, the future a luxury she could not afford to even imagine for herself. Lately, a new kind of letter had begun to appear, not for her but for her neighbors. They arrived in sleek, corporate envelopes, bearing the insignia of a company called Thorn Development. Rumors swirled through the small community like a coming storm. The butcher spoke of a non-negotiable buyout offer. The baker worried about being priced out. A sense of dread, cold and sharp, began to permeate the historic street. The abstract monster of debt was taking on a concrete form, a name, a corporation that saw their history not as something to be preserved, but as an outdated obstacle on a blueprint. The world she had hidden from was no longer passing by. It was coming for her, its shadow looming larger with each passing day. Standing in the silent shop one evening, surrounded by the towering shelves, Ilara felt the walls physically closing in. The air, usually thick with the comforting scent of old paper, now felt thin and suffocating. The books were no longer a sanctuary. They were the bars of her cell. Her father's labored breathing from upstairs was the sound of her ticking clock. The letters from the hospital and the whispers about Thorn Development were the footsteps of the executioner approaching. She was trapped, completely and utterly. There was no escape, no white knight, no secret passage to be found in the pages of her novels. The end was coming, and she was utterly alone, facing a future she had not chosen, and a life she no longer wanted to live. The name Julian Thorn had become a malevolent whisper on the historic street, a modern-day plague carried on the winds of change. He was known as the Architect of Ashes, a man who saw Boston not as a city of living history, but as a canvas of untapped real estate potential, a collection of outdated structures waiting to be raised and reborn as monuments of glass and steel. His company, Thorn Development, moved with the surgical precision of a predator, acquiring, demolishing, and rebuilding with a speed and ruthlessness that left communities breathless and broken. He didn't just buy properties. He erased legacies, replacing the warmth of brick and the stories of generations with the cold, impersonal reflection of the sky on 1,000 identical windows. His reputation was a weapon, forged in hostile takeovers and cemented in the rubble of what came before. He was the faceless monster from the letters, the embodiment of the rapacious world Ilara had feared for so long. What the city didn't know was that Julian's crusade was deeply personal. He was a man haunted not by ghosts, but by the vivid, gnawing memory of his own destitute childhood in a tenement that had been condemned and torn down. He equated history with decay, sentimentality with the weakness that had trapped his family in a cycle of poverty and despair. Every historic building he demolished was an act of vengeance against his own past. Every sterile tower he erected a fortress against the vulnerability he had sworn to never feel again. He had built an empire to insulate himself from the boy he once was, yet he was secretly starved for the very authenticity he so methodically destroyed. He collected and curated pieces of the past, art, artifacts, entire companies, but could never possess the one thing he truly craved, a history that felt like home, not a prison. The old brass bell above the bookshop's door chimed, a sound usually so gentle and familiar. But this time, it was different. It was a sharp, intrusive clang that seemed to fracture the sacred silence. A man stepped inside, and the very atmosphere of the room shifted, the air growing heavy and charged. The golden sunlight pouring through the window seemed to dim, and the dancing dust motes froze in their lazy descent, as if in deference to the immense gravity of his presence. He brought the outside world in with him, the scent of cold city air, expensive leather, and an unnerving, absolute stillness that was more powerful than any noise. He paused just inside the doorway, his shadow falling long and dark across the worn wooden floors, a stark, modern silhouette against the backdrop of crumbling, forgotten literature. He was an omen in a bespoke suit. Ilara felt his presence before she truly saw him, a primal awareness of a predator entering her sanctuary. When she looked up from the book she was mending, her breath caught in her throat. He was tall and impeccably dressed in a dark gray suit that seemed to absorb the light around it, but it was his face that held her captive. It was a composition of sharp angles and controlled severity, with a strong jaw and a mouth that looked as if it had never formed a genuine smile. His eyes, the color of a stormy sea, were the most arresting feature. They were intelligent, calculating, and utterly devoid of warmth as they swept across her shop, not with admiration, but with the cool, detached appraisal of an auctioneer assessing the value of every last item, including the trembling young woman standing behind the counter. Julian Thorne had come expecting to find a relic, the last desperate holdout of a dying business, run by a defeated old man. Instead, he found her. He took in the plain brown hair tied back in a simple knot, the faded blue sweater, the ink stain on her finger. She was unremarkable by the standards of the women who moved through his world. Yet, he couldn't look away. His gaze was drawn to the quiet intensity in her large hazel eyes that held not the fear or awe he was accustomed to, but a defiant, intelligent light. He saw the way her slender hands rested protectively on a worn, leather-bound volume, a gesture of such profound tenderness it felt almost indecent. In that moment, she was not an obstacle. She was an anomaly, a piece of living history he hadn't anticipated, an authentic artifact in a world of perfect reproductions. He moved toward the counter with a fluid, predatory grace, his expensive shoes making no sound on the creaking floorboards. He stopped before her, the massive oak counter the only thing separating their two vastly different worlds. "Ilara Vance?" he asked, his voice a low, resonant baritone that was as smooth and cold as polished marble. It was not a question so much as a confirmation. Without waiting for her reply, he produced a sleek, white envelope from the inside of his jacket. It was stark and clinical against the rich, chaotic backdrop of the shop. He held it out to her. "I am Julian Thorne. This is my company's final offer for this property. I suggest you read it carefully." The words were polite, but the tone was absolute, leaving no room for negotiation or sentiment. It was the sound of an ending. Ilara's heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic, trapped thing. Every instinct screamed at her to shrink away, to retreat into the shadows of the bookshelves. But then she looked at the pristine white envelope, the death warrant for her family's legacy, and a different feeling rose within her, a cold, quiet rage. She didn't reach for it. Instead, she lifted her chin and met his gaze directly. "Mr. Thorne," she began, her voice surprisingly steady, though she could feel a tremor in her hands. "This isn't just a property. It's 100 years of my family's history. It's a sanctuary for stories that the world has forgotten. Some things don't have a price tag. Some things, like a soul, are not for sale. She saw a flicker of surprise in his cold eyes, and it gave her a sliver of courage. Julian was momentarily taken aback. He was accustomed to people who either cowered before him or screamed at him, their emotions messy and predictable. He was not prepared for this. He was not prepared for the quiet, intellectual contempt delivered by a girl who looked as if a strong wind could blow her away. She hadn't raised her voice, hadn't pleaded or threatened. She had simply stated her truth with a conviction that was as solid and unyielding as the ancient building around them. He found himself inexplicably intrigued. This transaction, which he had considered a minor, final detail in a multi-million-dollar project, had suddenly become far more interesting. He saw the fire burning behind her timid facade and felt a dangerous, unfamiliar desire to see just how brightly it could burn if properly stoked. A heavy silence descended between them, charged with an energy that was both hostile and magnetic. In that extended moment, as their gazes remained locked, the world outside the dusty shop window seemed to fade away. For the first time, Elara saw past the ruthless magnate and glimpsed something else in the depths of his storm-gray eyes. It was a flicker of profound weariness, a deep-seated loneliness that resonated with the hollow ache in her own chest. And in her defiant, frightened face, Julian saw a purity he had long ago abandoned, an integrity he both scorned and secretly craved. It was a terrifying moment of recognition, an unspoken acknowledgement that they were two sides of the same solitary coin, each trapped in a prison of their own making. The air between them crackled with the impossible, undeniable pull of opposites. Finally breaking the spell, Julian placed the envelope on the counter, his long, manicured fingers brushing against the scarred wood. The stark white against the dark, aged surface was a perfect metaphor for their encounter. "My offer stands," he said, his voice once again cool and controlled, betraying none of the internal disturbance he felt. "I'll expect your decision soon." He turned and walked away without another word. The bell chimed his departure, its sound echoing in the now deafening silence. Elara stood frozen, her hand hovering over the envelope as if it were radioactive. She was trembling, but it was no longer just from fear. A new, terrifying emotion had taken root. A dangerous fascination with the man who had come to destroy her world. A man whose presence had shattered her quiet existence forever. The days that followed were a study in suspended dread. Julian Thorne's pristine white envelope lay on the counter like a piece of unexploded ordnance, a stark, modern intrusion into her world of aged sepia and faded gold leaf. Elara moved it from place to place, tucking it inside a ledger, then behind a stack of unsold poetry, as if hiding it would somehow diminish its power. Yet she could feel its presence from every corner of the shop, a silent, pulsing weight. She tried to lose herself in the familiar comfort of her books, to retreat into the fictional dramas of others, but his image was now superimposed over every page, the memory of his stormy gray eyes, cold and appraising, and the low, resonant timbre of his voice had breached her fortress walls, leaving a permanent crack in her carefully constructed silence. She found herself replaying their brief encounter with an obsessive, almost forensic detail. She dissected every word, every micro-expression that had crossed his severe, handsome face. She remembered the flicker of surprise when she had refused to be cowed, and the almost imperceptible softening of his jawline as he looked at her. It was this momentary vulnerability that haunted her most. The world saw a ruthless architect of destruction, but for a fleeting second, she had seen something else, a profound, cavernous loneliness that mirrored her own. This recognition was terrifying. It suggested a connection, a shared wound that she had no desire to explore. She despised him for what he represented, yet a dangerous, traitorous part of her psyche was drawn to the man who had seen past her meek exterior and recognized the fire within. Julian, in his sterile penthouse office overlooking the sprawling city, found himself in a state of uncharacteristic distraction. He stared at the holographic blueprint of the Thorn Tower that would one day stand where Elara's bookshop now stood, but he couldn't focus. Her face, pale and defiant, kept materializing in the empty spaces of the design. He had dealt with hundreds of holdouts, emotional property owners who clung to their pasts with a pathetic tenacity. They were all predictable, their arguments fueled by a sentimentality he despised. But she was different. Her defiance wasn't rooted in nostalgia. It was rooted in principle. She had looked at him not as a monster or a savior, but as an intellectual and moral equal who had been found wanting. The memory of her quiet, unyielding contempt was a strange and intoxicating irritant, a puzzle he felt a sudden, compelling need to solve. He had built his empire on the principle of emotional detachment. People were assets or liabilities, transactions to be managed with cold, logical precision. Yet, this girl, this custodian of a failing bookstore, had slipped past his defenses. He found himself thinking about the ink stain on her finger, the gentle way her hands cradled a broken book, the fierce intelligence burning in her hazel eyes. These were useless sentimental details that had no place in his world. He told himself his interest was purely strategic. She was the final, stubborn obstacle to a project worth hundreds of millions. But he knew, in a deeply unsettling corner of his mind, that it was more than that. He didn't just want her property anymore. He wanted to understand her. He wanted to possess the quiet strength she wielded like a shield, an authenticity his vast fortune could never buy. The inevitable phone call came on a Tuesday morning, a day so ordinary it felt like a cruel joke. It was the hospital. Her father had suffered a setback, a complication that required a new, aggressive, and astronomically expensive course of treatment. The doctor on the other end of the line spoke in a calm, clinical tone, using words like long-term specialized care and prohibitive cost. But all Alara heard was the sound of a door slamming shut on her last glimmer of hope. She hung up the phone, her hand still clutching the receiver, the plastic slick with a cold sweat. The numbers the doctor had quoted were not just numbers. They were a death sentence for the shop, for her legacy, and potentially for her father. The weight of her powerlessness was a physical thing, pressing the air from her lungs and leaving her gasping in the dusty silence. That evening, as she was locking the front door, she saw him. He was standing across the street, leaning against a sleek black car, the streetlight casting his tall frame in a dramatic silhouette. He wasn't looking at the shop. He was looking directly at her. There was no pretense, no surprise. He had been waiting. A cold knot of dread and something unnervingly like fate tightened in her stomach. He crossed the street with that same fluid, predatory grace, his presence commanding the entire block. He stopped a few feet from her, close enough that she could smell the faint, clean scent of his cologne mingling with the crisp night air. "I heard about your father," he said, his voice low and devoid of pity. It was a simple statement of fact, a demonstration of his reach, a reminder that there was no part of her life he couldn't touch if he chose to. He didn't invite her to his office. He didn't need to. Standing there, on the cracked pavement of her crumbling world, under the flickering gaslight-style lamps that lined the historic street, he laid out his new terms. The cold precision of his words was a stark contrast to the chaotic terror churning inside her. He would not just buy the property. He would create a trust to cover every single one of her father's medical expenses, for as long as he lived. He would ensure the finest care, the best doctors, the experimental treatments. He would even preserve the facade of Vance & Son, incorporating it into his new design as a, quote, historical tribute. His generosity was a stunning, brutal weapon. And then came the price. "In return," he said, his stormy eyes locking onto hers, "you will be my companion for 6 months. You will attend events with me. You will be available to me. A simple contract." Ilara felt the world tilt on its axis. The proposition was so audacious, so medieval, she could barely process it. He was asking her to sell herself. Not just her body, but her time, her presence, her very essence, every fiber of her being recoiled in disgust. It was a violation of everything she believed in, a desecration of the quiet dignity she had fought so hard to maintain. She thought of the heroines in her books, women of principle and strength, and felt a wave of profound shame. To even consider such a thing felt like a betrayal of them, of her father's legacy, of herself. Her mind screamed 1,000 different versions of no, her pride and her morality rising up in a unified, desperate rebellion against this monstrous, impossible bargain. The air grew thin, and she struggled to draw a breath that wasn't tainted by his corrupting offer. Yet as her mind raged, a single, devastating image cut through the noise, her father's face, pale and gaunt against the hospital pillow, his breathing shallow, his eyes filled with a weary fear, Love, she realized with a sickening clarity, was a far more powerful and terrifying force than pride. What was her dignity worth when weighed against his life? What was her autonomy when compared to his suffering? Julian Thorne had not just offered her a deal, he had presented her with an impossible moral equation where every possible answer was a form of self-destruction. To refuse was to sentence her father to inadequate care, to watch him fade away while she clung to a principle that could not pay for his medicine. To accept was to willingly step into a gilded cage, to become a possession of the very man who represented the soulless, rapacious world she so despised. That night sleep offered no escape. She wandered the dark, silent aisles of the bookstore, her bare feet cold on the old wooden floors. She ran her fingers over the spines of the books, these old friends who had offered her so much comfort and wisdom. But their stories of love, honor, and sacrifice felt like hollow mockeries now. They were fantasies, beautifully bound, but ultimately powerless against the harsh realities of a world run by men like Julian Thorne. She stopped before a first edition of Tess of the D'Urbervilles Asterisk, its cover worn soft by a century of hands. She saw herself in Tess's tragic plight, a woman trapped by circumstance and the cruel machinations of a powerful man. The realization was a cold stone in her gut. Her life was no longer her own story to write. The next chapter was being dictated by him. She sat behind the counter where he had stood, trying to see the world from his perspective. What did he see when he looked at her? A problem to be solved? An asset to be acquired? Or something more? A dangerous thought, insidious and unwelcome, slithered into her mind. She remembered the raw power radiating from him, the intense, focused way he had looked at her, as if she were the only person in the world. A shameful, deeply buried part of her, a part that had been starved of any real passion or attention, felt a flicker of something that was not entirely revulsion. It was a terrifying curiosity. What would it feel like to be the object of such singular, overwhelming focus? To step out of the shadows and into the blazing, dangerous light of his world. The thought made her feel sick with self-loathing, but it also made her feel, for the first time in years, terrifyingly alive. Julian waited. He had made his offer and retreated, leaving her to grapple with the choice he knew she had to make. He sat in his vast, empty penthouse, a glass of expensive whiskey in his hand, and stared out at the city lights. He told himself this was just business, a creative solution to a stubborn problem. But his usual sense of triumphant satisfaction was absent, replaced by a tense, unfamiliar anticipation. He was breaking his own cardinal rule: never get personally involved. This wasn't just about acquiring a property, it was about acquiring her. The thought of her in his apartment, at his side at a gala, her quiet intelligence, a startling contrast to the vapid socialites he endured, was a potent and disruptive fantasy. He was a collector of rare and beautiful things, and Alara Vance, with her fierce, fragile integrity, was the rarest artifact he had ever encountered. He found himself thinking about the books. He had never considered their value beyond their monetary worth as antiques. But her quiet insistence that they were sanctuaries, that they had souls, had lodged in his mind. He was a man who had methodically erased his own past, who had built a future on a foundation of forgotten rubble. What would it be like to have a history you fought to preserve rather than destroy? In his pursuit of Alara, he was unknowingly pursuing a connection to the very thing he spent his life annihilating. He was drawn to her light, even as his entire purpose was to extinguish it and build something new in its place. This internal conflict was new territory, a sign of weakness he refused to acknowledge, yet the pull toward her was as undeniable and powerful as gravity itself. The dilemma consumed Alara for 2 more days. She moved through the motions of her life in a fog of anguish, tending to her father, dusting the shelves, the unspoken choice hanging over her like a guillotine. She felt herself being stretched thin between 2 impossible futures, one of dignified poverty and certain loss, the other of compromised survival. She felt the crushing smallness of her world, the way her life wasn't truly hers but a collection of duties and inheritances. The phrase, "it's not going to fit," echoed in her mind. She couldn't fit into the role he was offering. She couldn't fit into his world of cold transactions and casual cruelty. The sheer scale of what he was asking felt too vast, too overwhelming for her carefully contained existence. It would break her. But what if she was already broken? Standing in the quiet twilight of the shop, she looked at her reflection in the dark glass of the front door. She saw a pale, tired ghost, a young woman prematurely aged by grief and responsibility. Perhaps the thing she was so afraid of losing, her control, herself, was already gone, sacrificed long ago on the altar of filial duty. Maybe this monstrous offer wasn't a cage, but a different kind of prison from the one she was already in. At least this one came with a future for her father. A bitter, resigned calm settled over her. It was the calm of a soldier accepting a suicide mission. The choice was not a choice at all. It was an inevitability. With a hand that trembled so violently she could barely hold her phone, she found the sleek, black business card he had left with the original offer. Thorne Development. Julian Thorne, CEO. The title seemed absurdly large, a symbol of the world she was about to enter. She stared at the number, her thumb hovering over the call button. Each digit seemed to represent a piece of herself she was about to sign away. This call was a leap into an abyss, a final, irrevocable step away from the quiet, predictable safety of her life. She was terrified, but beneath the fear was a strange, dark current of resolve. She pressed the button, the electronic tone sounding like a death knell in the hallowed silence of the bookshop. When his voice came on the line, low and controlled, without any preamble of a greeting, she almost dropped the phone. Thorne! It was a command, an acknowledgement, an entire world of power contained in a single word. Ilara took a deep, shuddering breath, the scent of old paper and dust filling her lungs for what felt like the last time. She closed her eyes, picturing her father's face, and spoke the two words that would seal her fate, her voice a reedy whisper that nonetheless carried the weight of her entire world. I accept. The silence on the other end of the line was heavy, charged, and in that moment she knew she had just sold her soul to the devil. And the most terrifying part was that she wasn't entirely sure she would regret it. The charity gala was a glittering, soulless affair, a cavern of crystal and forced laughter where fortunes were pledged with the same casual air as ordering a drink. Ilara, dressed in a sapphire silk gown Julian had chosen, felt like a beautifully curated object on display, another one of his rare acquisitions. She performed her role flawlessly, her knowledge of literature and history making her an unexpectedly charming conversationalist among the city's elite. But beneath the perfect smile and poised demeanor, a scream was building in her throat. Each clinking champagne flute, each murmur of calculated compliments, was a hammer blow against the walls of her composure. This was his world, a cold transactional stage, and she was suffocating under the weight of its artifice. The most important rule of their contract was her compliance, her quiet, elegant obedience, and she was about to shatter it. With a whispered, polite excuse, she slipped away from a circle of investors discussing market trends. Her escape was a desperate flight, her heels clicking softly on the marble floors as she navigated the maze of tables and bodies. She pushed through a set of heavy glass doors and found herself on a deserted stone terrace, the sudden silence a shocking relief. A blast of cold, clean November air hit her, a welcome shock to her senses after the stuffy, over-perfumed ballroom. Below, the city sprawled out in a breathtaking tapestry of light, indifferent and beautiful. Leaning against the cold balustrade, she closed her eyes, drawing the frigid air deep into her lungs, trying to purge the cloying scent of wealth and power from her system. This small act of defiance, this claiming of a single moment of solitude, felt like the most profound rebellion of her life. She did not hear him approach, but she felt his presence, a sudden shift in the energy behind her. He stood there, a dark silhouette against the bright doorway, watching her. When she turned, his face was unreadable in the shadows, but she knew he wasn't angry. The set of his shoulders was not that of a man whose prized possession had wandered off. It was the posture of someone who had followed a mystery. He walked toward her, his movements slow and deliberate, stopping just a foot away. The cold night air swirled between them, thick with unspoken questions. "You were supposed to stay by my side," he stated, but the words lacked their usual sharp edge of command. They were observational, almost questioning, as if he were trying to understand the motivation behind her flight, a variable he hadn't accounted for in his meticulous calculations. "I couldn't breathe in there," she confessed, her voice a raw whisper. She expected a reprimand, a cold reminder of their arrangement. Instead, he was silent for a long moment, his gaze fixed on her face, as if seeing it for the first time without the filter of their contract. "Neither can I," he admitted, and the words were so quiet, so utterly devoid of his usual armor, that she felt them like a physical blow. "They all look at me and see this." He gestured vaguely back at the glittering ballroom, at the city below. "This empire. They see Thorn development. They see power and money." He took a step closer, his stormy eyes locking onto hers, and in their depths, she saw the ghost of a hungry, frightened boy. "You," he said, his voice cracking almost imperceptibly, "are the only person who has ever looked at me and seen the ruins I was built on." The confession hung in the air between them, a raw, bleeding wound. It was an act of such profound vulnerability that it shattered every defense she had left. In that moment, he was not the monster who had come to destroy her world. He was just a man, as lonely and trapped in his gilded cage as she was in her dusty one. An invisible dam inside her broke, and all the fear, resentment, and the terrifying, forbidden attraction she felt for him crested into a single, overwhelming wave. He reached out, his hand cupping her jaw, his thumb stroking her cheek with a tenderness that belied his reputation. And then he kissed her. It was not a kiss of seduction or conquest. It was a desperate, hungry collision, a frantic act of recognition between two starving souls. It was the taste of desperation, of loneliness, of a shared, unspoken pain. When the kiss broke, they were both breathless, the cold air stinging their lungs. The contract, the money, the bookstore, all of it had dissolved into ash in the fire of that single, desperate moment. This was real, terrifyingly real, and it had moved far beyond the boundaries of their business arrangement. He rested his forehead against hers, his eyes closed, his breathing ragged. He was no longer in control, and the realization seemed to both terrify and liberate him. A silent understanding passed between them. This night would not end with him dropping her off at the bookshop. It was a point of no return. Without a word, he took her hand, his grip firm and possessive but also strangely protective, and led her back through the ballroom, past the oblivious crowds, their two figures moving as one through a world that no longer mattered. The silent ride to his penthouse was a journey through a dreamscape. The city lights blurred into long, abstract streaks of gold and white through the tinted windows of his car, a world outside moving at a different speed while their own had slowed to a single thudding heartbeat. The silence in the car was not empty. It was a living entity, filled with the echo of his confession and the ghost of their kiss. Alara watched his hands on the steering wheel, strong and capable, the same hands that had held her face with such desperate tenderness. She was willingly walking into the heart of his fortress, a place she knew was designed to keep the world out. This was her final transgression, not against him or her family, but against the frightened, timid girl she had always been, the girl who lived her life between the pages of a book. His penthouse was a testament to his life, vast, minimalist, and breathtakingly empty. It was a cavern of glass and shadow perched atop the city, with floor-to-ceiling windows that displayed the glittering skyline like a conquered territory. The air was cool and still, the only sound the faint, distant hum of the metropolis below. He led her not to the living area but directly to his bedroom. The room was dominated by a massive bed, a stark white island in a sea of gray and black. It felt less like a place of rest and more like an altar. Standing before it, a fresh wave of terror washed over Alara. The sheer scale of it all, the room, the view, the man beside her, was overwhelming. The reality of what she was about to do, the finality of it, settled in her bones, making her tremble uncontrollably. Her gaze fell from his face to the bed, and then to the space between them, a chasm of experience and fear. All her anxieties, all her feelings of inadequacy, of being too small for his enormous world, coalesced into a single, choked whisper. "It's not going to fit," she breathed, the words barely audible, her eyes wide with a primal fear of the unknown. It was a confession of her deepest insecurity. Not just a physical fear, but the terror that her small, sheltered soul could not possibly fit into the vast, complicated emptiness of his. Julian's expression, which had been a mask of tense desire, crumbled. For the first time, she saw him look truly vulnerable. He gently lifted her chin with his fingers, forcing her to meet his gaze. His voice was raw, stripped of all its power and command. "Then I will make myself smaller," he promised, his thumb tracing the line of her jaw. "I will be gentle." His promise was the most intimate thing he had ever said to her. It was not the assurance of a predator soothing his prey, but the plea of a man offering a piece of his own fractured soul. This was the true surrender, not of her body, but of her trust. And in that moment she made her choice. She let go of the fear, of the girl she was, of the fortress she had hidden inside for so long. She reached up and placed her small, ink-stained hand against his chest, feeling the frantic, unsteady beat of his heart beneath her palm. It was a heart that beat just as wildly as her own. He looked down at her, not with hunger or triumph, but with a kind of desperate, reverent awe. The act that followed was not an act of possession, but a quiet, terrifyingly beautiful exchange of trust, a gentle mending of two broken things in the silent heart of the lonely city. The dawn that broke over Julian's penthouse was a cold, clinical affair, painting the minimalist gray room in shades of sterile blue and silver. Ilara awoke alone. The vast bed, which had been a stage for such terrifying and profound intimacy, was now just an empty expanse of high thread-count sheets, cool against her skin. A profound sense of dislocation washed over her. She was an anachronism in this world of glass and steel, a dusty first edition left on a sterile metal shelf. The scent of him lingered on the pillow beside her, a ghostly reminder of the man who had promised to be gentle, the man who had shared a sliver of his broken soul before vanishing, leaving her adrift in the silent, breathtaking emptiness of his life. She felt less like a lover and more like a secret that had been told and then immediately forgotten by the morning light. He had not left without a trace. On the marble nightstand, a single sheet of heavy cream paper was folded neatly in half. It was not a note of affection or even acknowledgement, but a set of cold, efficient instructions. "A car will be waiting for you downstairs at 8 a.m. My driver, Robert, will see you home. I have a meeting in Zurich." It was signed simply, Thorn, his name a sharp, angular slash of black ink. The gentleness of the night, the raw vulnerability in his voice when he'd promised to make himself smaller, had evaporated with the darkness. He had retreated back into the impenetrable fortress of his identity as Julian Thorn, CEO. The intimacy they had shared was now recontextualized as a clause in their contract, an asset that had been successfully acquired and logged. She was an item to be managed, and her dismissal was just another task on his morning agenda. The journey back to the bookshop was a silent, surreal passage between two separate realities. The sleek, silent interior of the black sedan was a world away from the creaking, history-soaked floors of her home. As Robert, the stoic driver, pulled up to the curb, Ilara felt a wave of nausea. Stepping out of the car and back onto the familiar cracked pavement felt like a betrayal. The old brass bell above the door chimed her entry, the sound accusatory in the morning stillness. The air inside, thick with the comforting scent of decaying paper and binding glue, now felt suffocating. His world had left its mark on her, the faint, clean scent of his cologne clinging to her clothes and skin, a foreign element that had contaminated her sanctuary. She was no longer just its custodian. She was its desecrator, a ghost haunting her own life with the memory of another. She avoided her own reflection, terrified of the woman she would see. The girl who had left this shop yesterday was gone, replaced by someone who had willingly stepped into the abyss. Guilt was a physical presence, a cold, heavy stone in the pit of her stomach. She ran a trembling hand over the spines of the books, these silent witnesses to her life, and felt a profound sense of shame. She had sold her family's legacy, her body, her very soul, for a night of desperate, fleeting connection with the man who was its destroyer. What would her father, in his proud, literary prime, think of her now? The heroines she had lived through, Elizabeth Bennet, Jane Eyre, were women of principle and unyielding spirit. She felt she had failed them all, trading her integrity for a form of survival that felt chillingly like its own kind of death. In his private jet, soaring miles above the earth, Julian stared, unseeing, at the clouds, a portfolio of architectural plans untouched on the table before him. The calculated coldness of his departure had been a necessary act of self-preservation. Her presence had breached defenses he hadn't known were still active. The memory of her trust, The feel of her small hand on his chest, the quiet surrender in her eyes. It was all a dangerous, chaotic variable in the meticulously ordered equation of his life. He had spent his entire adult life building walls to keep the memory of that hungry, powerless boy locked away, and in one night she had walked through them as if they were made of mist. He was furious with himself for his weakness, for the uncharacteristic gentleness he had shown her. He had sought to possess her authenticity, and instead, it had exposed his own profound emptiness. A week bled into another, and the silence between them became a tangible thing, a chasm that grew wider and deeper with each passing day. For Elara, it was a cruel and definitive statement. She had been a curiosity, a chapter to be read and then closed. The intimacy, which had felt so monumental and life-altering to her, had clearly been nothing more than a transaction for him. Each morning she woke with a hollow ache, the phantom feeling of his touch a constant, tormenting reminder of her folly. For Julian, the silence was a form of control, an attempt to reset their dynamic back to the cold, clear lines of their contract. Yet, it was a failed effort. Her absence from his life was a louder presence than her company had ever been, the memory of her, a persistent ghost in his sterile, empty rooms. The confirmation of their bargain arrived not with a phone call or a personal visit, but through the mail. It was a thick, corporate envelope from Thorne Development's accounting department. Inside, there was no letter, only a series of documents. A receipt for the full payment of all outstanding debts on the Vance & Son property, and a detailed statement outlining the establishment of a multi-million-dollar trust for the lifelong medical care of Arthur Vance. The cold, black-and-white finality of the papers stole the air from her lungs. This was her price, itemized and quantified. It was proof of his power and her powerlessness, a brutal reminder that what had felt like a moment of shared humanity to her was, to him, just another liability settled, another asset secured. The paper felt heavy in her hands, weighted with the full, crushing cost of her sacrifice. Visiting her father at the new private care facility was an exercise in quiet torture. The sterile, sunlit room was a world away from the dim, cramped apartment above the shop. He was sitting up in bed, his color better, his breathing steady, and even for the first time in years, he smiled when he saw her, a genuine, hopeful smile that she hadn't seen since before her mother's death. "You did this, Elara?" he whispered, his voice thick with emotion as he squeezed her hand. "You saved me." His gratitude was a shard of glass in her heart. She was his miracle, his dutiful daughter, who had moved mountains for him. She smiled back, a brittle, fragile thing, and nodded, unable to speak past the lie lodged in her throat. Every beat of the heart monitor, every clean sheet and attentive nurse, was a testament to the night she had spent in Julian Thorne's bed. Yet, in the long, silent hours she spent back at the bookshop, a strange and unexpected transformation began to take place. The initial waves of shame and guilt began to recede, leaving behind not emptiness, but a hard, resilient bedrock of self she hadn't known existed. She had stepped into the heart of the world she feared most, had faced the man who was its king, and had survived. The act that she believed would irrevocably break her had instead burned away the timid, frightened girl she used to be. A new strength, forged in the crucible of her transgression, began to settle in her bones. She was no longer a victim of circumstance, a passive character in a story written by others. She had made an impossible choice, and in doing so had seized control of her own narrative, however painful the plot. Standing in the twilight-drenched silence of her shop, Elara ran her fingers over a worn copy of Jane Eyre. She thought of Jane's quiet defiance in the face of Mr. Rochester's power, her insistence on being seen as an equal soul. The silence from Julian was not an ending, it was an ellipsis. She could not go back to being the girl who hid in books, nor could she be his purchased companion, a ghost at his galas. The contract had been about power, but their night together had been about a desperate, flawed connection that defied its terms. She realized with a sudden, shocking clarity that she was not powerless. She was the sole keeper of his vulnerability, the one person who had seen the ruins he was built on. The story was not over. She would write the next chapter herself. 3 months passed, a season turning from the crisp melancholy of autumn to the stark, quiet cold of winter. Elara found herself drawn, not to the new care facility where her father was thriving, but to the skeletal remains of her old life. She stood across the street from the construction site, a gaping wound in the heart of the historic block. The facade of Vance & Son had been preserved, as promised, propped up by a web of steel scaffolding. It looked like a beautiful hollow mask, its windows dark and vacant, a historical tribute that felt more like a taxidermied memory. The new Thorn Tower was rising behind it, a monster of glass and steel devouring the sky. She felt no grief, only a strange, quiet resolve. This place was not a tomb. It was a crossroads, a place where one story had ended so another could begin. She wasn't certain he would come, but some deep, intuitive current pulled her here on this specific gray afternoon. She had a feeling this place was a magnet for him too, the monument to both his greatest ambition and his most profound failure. She waited, the cold wind whipping strands of hair across her face, the scent of wet concrete and steel filling the air. In her hands, she clutched a small object wrapped in soft linen. In the weeks of silence, she had come to understand the true meaning of her whispered fear. It was never about his world being too big, but about her own being too small. She had not been broken by him. She had been forced to expand, to grow into a woman who could withstand the weight of his world and still recognize the shape of her own soul. A sleek black car, silent as a shadow, pulled up to the curb. Julian Thorne stepped out, and for a moment her breath caught. He looked different. The impeccable, predatory polish was gone, replaced by a deep weariness etched around his eyes and in the set of his shoulders. He was still a king surveying his kingdom, but he looked like a king who had forgotten how to sleep. He saw her immediately, and his entire body went still. He had likely expected to find this space empty, a clean slate for his legacy. Instead, he found her, a ghost from the past who was stubbornly, defiantly alive. He crossed the street slowly, his expensive shoes crunching on the gravel, his stormy eyes fixed on her, filled not with anger or possession, but with a raw, uncertain question. They stood face to face amidst the controlled chaos of creation and destruction, the roar of machinery a distant, muted soundtrack to their silence. There were 1,000 things she could have said, 1,000 accusations she could have leveled, but words were his weapons, the tools of his contracts and negotiations. Her power lay elsewhere. She looked at him, not with the fear of a victim or the adoration of a lover, but with the clear, steady gaze of an equal. She saw the ruins he was built on, and she was no longer afraid of them. After a long moment that seemed to stretch into an eternity, she broke the silence not with her voice, but with a gesture. She held out the small linen-wrapped package, an offering made on the very ground they had fought over. He hesitated for only a second before his hands, long and sure, reached out to accept it. His fingers brushed against hers, a fleeting touch of warmth in the biting cold. As he unwrapped the linen, he revealed a small, worn, leather-bound book, its spine softened by a century of touch. It was a first edition of Keats' poetry, the one her father used to read aloud in the quiet evenings above the shop. "You kept the facade," she said, her voice quiet but clear over the city's hum. "But a building is just a body. This is the soul you tried to buy." It was not an indictment, but a final, profound truth. He looked from the fragile book in his hands to her face, and in the depths of his eyes she saw it all: the regret, the longing, and the devastating, unspoken acknowledgement of what he had truly lost. With a small, sad, but resolute smile, Ilara turned and walked away. She did not look back. She left him standing there, a solitary figure in the shadow of his rising empire, holding the one thing his fortune could never build and his power could never erase. She was walking not into the past, but into a future she would finally write for herself, on her own terms. What becomes of a man who owns the world but is handed back a soul? Their next chapter remains unwritten, a story we invite you to imagine. If you believe in the power of second chances and the stories that shape us, we ask you to subscribe to our channel, like this video, and share your thoughts in the comments below.